Okay, I make that 10 o'clock. So good morning, everyone. I hope you're doing well. We are going to be talking today about whether or not you can engineer justice. The reason for talking about this is because your task, should you choose to accept it, is to try and come up with a new declaration of rights for the 21st century. And obviously, rights have an underlying conceit or an underlying assumption that by enshrining rights into law or some other device, maybe not law, but perhaps custom or habit, that you will develop a better society, that the act of legislating in favor of rights will make those rights somehow come to pass. So that is part of the conceit of human rights law. And what we're going to be discussing today are some of the arguments around the extent to which you can engineer social outcomes using ideas. Now, it might sound like a slightly odd topic. Your instant reaction is likely to be, well, obviously you can engineer outcomes with social engineering, because otherwise no one would talk about it, no one would bother even trying. And people have for thousands of years been coming up with very clever ways to manipulate society through devices that come very close to sort of mechanical engineering. If you go all the way back to the Code of Hammurabi, which is considered one of the earliest human rights documents that exists in the world, or it's not even rights really, it's more sort of government rights. But anyway, they're one of the first sort of legal documents in human history. That was a clear contrivance, a clear attempt to engineer society using principles, using theory, using logic to try and sort of make certain inputs come out with certain outputs. So if we can think of engineering as like a mechanical metaphor, the leaders, the governors, try to engineer outcomes by changing the inputs and how those inputs are processed. This is taken so seriously in some countries that they hire engineers, people that literally have expertise in mechanical engineering in order to try and achieve social outcomes. In China, for example, the members of the Politburo, which is the governing body of the People's Republic, they are almost exclusively trained in engineering, the science of engineering, the engineering of stuff, of material, of physics. And yet they apply the principles they learn from engineering in physics to engineering societies. And that's a really fascinating theoretical step to take. This notion that you can engineer a social outcome almost to the same degree that you can engineer a physical outcome. And it's just a truly fascinating thing to explore in greater depth, because we often sort of assume that we can control social processes and we can engineer social processes as if society was some big metaphorical machine. And that's what I want to get under the bonnet of today. Okay. So we're going to be talking about democratic engineering. Now, if you go back to sort of the very earliest notions of engineering societies, you can talk about Hammurabi, but you can also talk about the 12 tables of the Roman Empire. You can talk about the ancient Greeks, in particular Plato and his Republic, where he came up with a constitutional framework to try and control society. The thing with quite a lot of those ancient laws is that their ambition was order, stability, peace of a kind. They weren't seeking anything much more ambitious than that. They were just trying to stop society from breaking down. They didn't have ambitions for society to grow or to develop anything akin to principles of justice. So it may be relatively straightforward to engineer stability, but if you want to engineer justice, then you're talking about a social framework which helps people develop their talents or helps them alleviate unfairness in their social context, or helps them overcome vast disparities in resource acquisition and ownership. So that's a much more ambitious project, and it can entail a far bigger state entity, a far bigger role for government in order to obtain that sort of just outcome. So you need to be very careful when you're thinking about whether or not you can engineer justice. You need to think about the distinction between engineering order versus engineering something more positive, something more ambitious than simply just stopping everyone from killing each other. If our only ambition was to ensure peace and that people don't kill each other, then we could envisage a state similar to that which was proposed by Thomas Hobbes in the 17th century. In other words, something that's just a huge leviathan, a very powerful, overarching government that just stops people from killing each other, but does nothing more than that. It doesn't care a hoot about whether or not you have a fair, equitable, just existence. It only cares about you not killing your neighbor. And that's kind of what most states are oriented towards. They just sort of quell our animalistic, our bestial instincts. But some people want to go much further than that. They're far more ambitious, that societies can develop fairness, equity, justice, not just order. Anyway, there are some specific subsidiary questions that I want to go through that will hopefully unpack this problem a little bit more clearly for you. So first of all, what explains different constitutional choices in newer and older democracies? So why do different countries make different choices when they try and engineer their constitutions? The constitution, if you like, is the blueprint. If you're trying to engineer this social mechanism that will translate certain inputs into certain outputs, then the constitution is the ultimate blueprint. That is the base code, if you want to use another metaphor. So the constitution is fundamentally important. The next question is whether or not we should go for what we should think about with regard to size. Do we think that we want a smaller constitution, which is more precise perhaps, less cumbersome, less burdensome, or do we want a long constitution? What's the difference? If you're trying to engineer some sort of just and equitable outcome, are you better off having a very precise short document or something that's quite long and extensive? And finally, should constitutions be easy to change? How important is that? If you've got this blueprint and it's very difficult to change, is that better than if it's very easy to change? So those are the questions we're going to talk about, and we're going to be comparing the countries of the world to see how they've tried to solve these different problems. Okay, so let's start with comparing new and old democracies. So what are the different constitutional choices that have been made by new and old democracies? Now, I'm going to be using some data from an excellent website called the Comparative Constitutions Project, or CCP. Now, if you're interested, just Google Comparative Constitutions Project. They've got loads of very useful data on the world's constitutions. They've also got all of the world's constitutions in English, and you can compare different elements of them. So if you want to get some ideas as to how you could frame a 21st century Declaration of Rights, go and check out how countries have literally done that. You can say, for instance, isolate a particular right, maybe freedom of speech or freedom from, freedom from sort of false imprisonment. And you can compare all the different constitutions and how they've framed those particular rights. So go and check that out. Comparative Constitutions Project. Anyway, in their quantitative data, they've got these 6 metrics: the scope of the Constitution, so how many different categories does it cover? And they've got 92 topics in their survey, which is a comprehensive survey of all of the world's constitutions. And it's a percentage of those 92 topics that gives you a sense of the scope of a constitution. They've got the length in words, which is a fairly straightforward metric. They've got executive power, which is measured from 0, no executive power, to 7. And it's a discrete one, so you can't have any number. It has to be whole numbers only, integers. You've got legislative power, which is the mean of 32 binary measures, so 32 0 or 1 measures. You've got judicial independence, which is on a scale from 0 to 6. And you've got the number of rights, which is just enumerated in numbers. Now, of course, these metrics you will hopefully already think have some flaws to them. I mean, for example, counting the number of rights in a constitution may not give you a very accurate sense of how rights-oriented that constitution is. One right might be all-encompassing, and it might therefore have the capacity to achieve far more than a similar list of hundreds of rights. So quantification is always a messy business, but nonetheless, don't make the best the enemy of the good. If this works, then we can at least sort of use it for now, but make sure that we're critically aware of its potential flaws. Anyway, let's just check everything's working all right. I think so. Yes. Okay. Anyway, getting back to it. So here are those 6 metrics described through time. So on the x-axis, you can see the number of years. So this gives us a sense of how older constitutions compared to newer constitutions. The oldest constitution in this survey is the US Constitution. Obviously, there's lots of debate as to whether or not the US is the oldest continuously operative constitution. According to the Comparative Constitutions Project, actually the UK has the oldest continuously operative constitution, for which there's a decent claim for that as well, but these things are all a bit messy and debatable. Anyway, let's just, for the sake of ease, take the US as the starting point. So we're going back at least 230 years to the founding of the US Constitution in 1787, and all of the years subsequent to that. So as you can see, there have been far more constitutions in the mid to late 20th century come about. So that's why there are far more spots towards the right-hand side of the graph. And we can see, according to the y-axis, that the scope of constitutions has gradually increased with time. There's quite a wide variance in contemporary constitutions, but there does seem to be a pretty clear correlation between time and scope. So as time has gone on, newer constitutions tend to be more ambitious. They have broader scope. They intend to achieve more than older constitutions did. Older constitutions were perhaps happy with a fairly limited role for government. These days, the conception in our minds of what a state ought to do is far more ambitious than our forefathers used to have. I mean, even within the 20th century, you can see this in the UK. In 1900, the share of debt to GDP that the government was responsible for, in other words, government spending as a proportion of GDP, was 4% in 1900. By 2000, it was 44%. So it had increased as a proportion 11-fold. So an extraordinary just expansion in the responsibilities, the monetary responsibilities of the state. And that's quite apart from all of its other legal and social responsibilities as well. The state has just become a much bigger entity in everyone's lives. Anyway, you can see that from that chart. The length of constitutions, however, has not seemingly changed a great deal. So even though the scope has increased massively, the length of constitutions on average hasn't increased much. But again, as you can see from the distribution of these dots, each of which is a single constitution, there's quite a wide variance. And there are some outliers as well. India is the one that outliers all the way to the very top. That's the spot all on its own because it's incredibly long, far longer than any other constitution in the world. But most constitutions are packed in around the sort of 40 to 50,000 word mark, something like that. Okay. What about executive power? Well, this is a pretty clear correlation with time. Executive powers have gone up on average, but again, with a wide variance. So we need to be slightly careful not to overgeneralize or overconclude about the nature of executive power. But it's still striking that newer constitutions give more power to the executive, in other words, the government. But they don't give more power to legislatures, or at least not as much. So lawmakers in, say, parliaments aren't getting quite as much of a bonus from newer constitutions as executives are, which is interesting. Okay, and judicial independence has not changed a great deal either. Judges are marginally more independent according to the data than they were in the past, but it's marginal, and there is again very wide variance between different countries. And the number of rights, however, has gone up quite noticeably, and that this is a pretty marked correlation. And contemporary constitutions still have quite a wide variance in the number of rights they have, but gone are the days where a constitution would have almost no rights, or a handful, maybe 10. These days, it's common to have lots, even up to 100 in some cases. There's some really fascinating examples. And again, I suggest you go and have a look at the Comparative Constitutions Project and see what sort of rights exist. You might be quite surprised. Some of the things that are enumerated as human rights or civil rights in various countries might raise an eyebrow and really challenge your conception of what a right is. I mean, for example, in Estonia and Finland, there are rights to high-speed broadband access, which is really fascinating. From the British context, we would find that quite surprising that you would have a civil right to broadband. I suppose, if you think about it, it's not an unreasonable right to have in a modern, globally connected world, especially in a country like Finland, which has very remote regions which might otherwise be entirely cut off from the contemporary economy if they didn't have high-speed broadband. But in this country, we would tend to think that that would be something better left to just regular legislation rather than a human right, which seems to sort of give it a higher status. But that's why I think it's such an interesting case, because you can really challenge yourself on what you think a human right is or ought to be. Okay, now, in case you're interested, this is where the UK is positioned on each of those 6 metrics relative to other countries. What I'm using is the Z-score, which is the number of standard deviations away from the mean. So a Z-score of 0 would mean that the UK was positioned exactly on the mean of all countries. And if it's 1 standard deviation away, then it's basically in the mix. It's kind of within about 65% of all constitutions, and Britain's somewhere there. If it's 2 standard deviations away, then it's actually only one in 20 constitutions is anything like the UK. So then it's becoming a bit more unusual. So according to these data, the scope of the British Constitution is lower than average. The length is much greater than average. The executive power, surprisingly, in Britain is marked as substantially lower than average. Now, this clearly highlights a problem with these measures, is that they're suggesting that Britain has very low executive power. But that's probably because, according to the British Constitution, we have a parliamentary democracy, and Parliament is the sovereign. And so in that conception, you would imagine that there would be very limited executive power. But obviously, as we know, in reality, the executive can dominate Parliament through the use of political parties. So even though on paper it looks like we don't have much executive power, in reality we do. Another thing that's slightly confusing from these data is that legislative power is quite low in Britain relative to other countries. The judicial independence in the UK is very, very marginally above average, but it's not statistically significant. And the number of rights is marginally below the average. Okay, so that just gives you a sort of sense of where the UK sits on all of this. So there's some quite interesting differences in choice now between older and newer constitutions. Now, we need to have a think about the very concept of choice. How far does someone choose or design a constitution and therefore come up with some engineering proposition? If we think about choice, we tend to imagine this sense of free agency, that someone's got a suite of options and they are able to pick from them in a way that they think is going to be most effective. But actually, if you look into the psychology of choice, a lot of the time what we perceive as a choice is actually somewhat predetermined. That although we in theory have multiple options to choose from, those options get whittled down very quickly by things like our habits, things like our context, things like what other people expect us to choose. And that's likely to be the same of someone who's a constitutional engineer. They might think, I can do whatever I like. I have complete free agency. But the likelihood is that they are subject to all sorts of psychological limitations, some of which they may not even be conscious of. Anyway, nonetheless, there are some very famous examples of lawgivers, as they're sometimes called, these constitutional engineers of antiquity up to the present day, who are credited with trying to engineer society in order to obtain peace or justice, or both. And they are all... many of the most famous are collected in this mural at Lincoln's Inn. Lincoln's Inn is one of the barristers' inns of court in London. If you want to become a barrister in England or Wales, you have to go through one of the 4 inns of court in London. And Lincoln's Inn is one of the 4. And it's got this very grand dining hall. And at the back of the dining hall, they've got this fabulous mural on which are depicted the most important lawgivers, as they think, in human history. So this goes back to people like Jesus and Muhammad, Moses. These are all sort of very important lawgivers because the Bible and the Quran contains a lot of law. And so these are considered to be people that came up with important legal principles that help obtain justice around the world. Also in the mural is Napoleon, because of the Napoleonic Code, which is a very important contribution to civil law. There's King John, who was the king that sealed Magna Carta, so he had to give up some of his power to the barons in 1215. So lots of people that are very strongly and importantly connected with producing law. Now, maybe King John is a good example because he didn't really have a choice. He was forced at the point of a sword and a crossbow bolt to seal Magna Carta. He didn't really have a choice. So he might be credited with this sort of fantastic step forward in human history, which was Magna Carta, but he didn't have any choice over that. He didn't want that. He tried to undo it almost immediately. He tried to get the Pope to undo it, but he failed. So have a very careful think about what you think control is and what you think choice is. When someone says, I've chosen this particular design for a constitution, for a society, for anything, how much choice is going on there? Do they actually have true free agency? I mean, that's quite a deep philosophical question and worth a bit of thought. Anyway, there are various sort of institutional design rationales, so where people are trying to solve particular problems. So they might start with durability. They want their constitution to just survive. And there are various fail-safes you can put into a constitution to try and make sure it survives. It doesn't collapse. It doesn't face internal opposition. It doesn't get overthrown by some sort of coup. And there are various interesting sort of examples of this. And if you want to see some of these further readings, just get in touch with me and I'll share you some of the authors that are listed here. Another thing to do might be to try and control specific intercommunal violence. So in many societies, there are relatively distinct groups that fight with each other over resources and power. And so you might want to design your constitution to try and bring those groups together or to give them some autonomy from each other so they don't fight so much. So an example close to home would be in Northern Ireland. Northern Ireland uses a constitutional design called power sharing. And that means that the different communities, the nationalist community and the unionist community, have to share power, otherwise the government collapses. And so the constitution is designed not only to try and obtain peace, but also to try and get some workaround for this intercommunal conflict that's been going on for hundreds of years in Ireland. So that's another sort of design rationale which some argue works occasionally, but of course, as you may have seen, the Northern Ireland Assembly and the executive has not been operative for a long time because the two sides just wouldn't agree. There's also sort of trying to consider how to obtain peace and justice. And one interesting concept is what's known as loser's consent. Now, a very well-designed constitution will not only think about how do winners get what they want, but also how do losers accept their loss. Now, this is a really fascinating insight because it's one of the most important parts of ensuring sustainable peace. And if you think about it, it's completely intuitive. If there is, if you're having an argument with a friend or a sibling, and that argument is resolved magnificently in favor of the winning person, such that the loser just not only lost that argument, but loses loads of their, money or friends or, I don't know, happiness or something like that. It's a completely appalling loss. That person is just going to extract themselves from any future debate, and they might just become a rogue entity. Well, the same thing happens in societies. If the winning team wins so much that the losers just think the whole system is rigged against them, the losers will eventually get sick of it and rise up and take control through some sort of bloody revolution. And you can see in some societies that they haven't quite so carefully dealt with losers' consent. I think the US is a good example of this, where they tend to double down on winning and they don't think about how to manage loss and how to make people alleviate the pain and the suffering of losing so that they can at least accept that the game is relatively fair. You won't continue to play a board game if you think that when you lose a round, that's systematic, that's somehow because the game is rigged against you. And so that's something to think about when it comes to designing institutions. Don't only design how to win, but how to lose as well. Okay, so what other things can explain different constitutional choices? Well, as I mentioned, not everything is a choice. Certain times become very important for constitutional change. So there can be just events can get in the way. So, for example, the Second World War was a very important moment in constitutional design. And the fall of the Berlin Wall was another important moment. Sometimes just this sort of confluence of forces all come together at specific points in time when the opportunity arises for a new design of a constitution, some sort of revolutionary overhaul. And that's not something that the constitution designers really have much control over. Another thing to think about is whether or not there is a groundswell of support for a constitution. This is what's sometimes called constitutionalism. In other words, does the society want this new constitution? If you take something like the French Revolution or the American Revolution, there was strong grassroots support for a change in the government system. And so there was a strong sort of connection between the citizens and this new constitutional setup. But in some countries, the constitution is kind of forced from the top down, and therefore the population don't really believe in it. They don't really want it necessarily. Again, there are some famous examples after the Second World War. So Germany and Japan were forced to change their constitutions by the occupying powers after the Second World War. They didn't have a local grassroots connection to the institutional design, but they didn't have any choice but to take it on. And because the Allied powers stayed in both of those countries, they're still there. They still have military bases in both countries. They were basically forced at gunpoint to take on these new constitutions. So the German constitution is a really fascinating hybrid of the British and the American system. It's got British parliamentary democracy and American federalism, and all of it was designed by the Allied powers in order to obtain peace and justice within Germany, even though no one in Germany at that time had come up with the design themselves, nor felt any particular connection to it. But over time, they forged a connection to that constitutional settlement because they didn't have any choice. So that's a really interesting example, again, of whether or not you can choose to design a constitution or whether those choices get sort of imposed on you. There's also this notion of incrementalism, which is how constitutions adapt to new contexts and new circumstances, and internationalism, so the role of other actors on the international stage. And so that, again, connects with what I was just talking about with regard to the Allies and their imposition of constitutions on Germany, Japan, Austria, and Italy. But you can also see it in a more subtle way, that sometimes international actors influence other countries, but they don't force them to make certain choices. So it's a little bit like sort of keeping up with the Joneses or a bit of fashion. Oh, that country's got this great new human right for broadband, so we better have it as well. You know, it's no coincidence that Finland and Estonia, who are neighboring countries, both adopted these rights to broadband at a similar time. They were sort of copying each other. And that's kind of what happens in human societies and of all levels, from, you know, your local town all the way up to the international sphere, is that when someone else does something that's cool and new, you kind of want to do it yourself. So there's that element of design as well to think about when it comes to engineering justice. Anyway, so we've had to think about sort of how constitutions have changed their design rationales over time. So let's move on to a question of length. Which is better, a shorter or a longer constitution? Let's say you're trying to engineer a just society. You're trying to engineer a society that not only maintains peace and stability, but actually also procures certain social goods for its citizens. It makes its citizens stronger, better developed, happier, maybe, living in a more equitable relationship with each other. You know, these are really ambitious goals, and it can be very difficult for a few individuals to obtain those outcomes for millions, potentially even over 1 billion people. So, you know, this is no small feat. So what would your initial thought be? Do you think you go short constitution, keep it simple, keep it clear so that you get good public buy-in, so that the citizens get what they're supposed to do? Or do you want something that's very long and therefore sort of deals with almost every possible eventuality? I suppose if you analogize to a computer code, then you would imagine you'd want it as comprehensive as possible, and that any bugs you could fix later with amendments. Something like the Facebook algorithm is 2 million lines long or something. 20 million lines long. So it's enormously long, right? So that's because it needs to try and manage all possible circumstances. But it could be that that is excessively burdensome, and that having a shorter code will be more manageable, more accessible, and more adaptable. So it's an interesting debate, but there's all sorts of things written on it. We also need to think about, well, what words matter? When we count the number of words and therefore the length of a constitution, what sort of words are the most operative, the most important? In my own research, I found out that the use of adjectives and conjunctions are very dangerous in constitutions because they are difficult to interpret. and therefore they give more power to powerful people who can use that ambiguity to their advantage. So it's all very well having longer or shorter constitutions. The length is not as important as the type of words that are used to obtain that length, which is a thing to think about. Okay, so you need to have a sense of who gains from having more rather than more rather than fewer words in a constitution. Okay, you also sort of need to consider the efficiency of language. So sometimes even just a very small number of words can achieve an awful lot. A famous example is the elastic clause, which is Article 1, subsection 8 of the US Constitution. And this states that the federal government, so that's Congress, the President, Supreme Court, etc., they can do anything that is, quote, necessary and proper to achieve their enumerated powers. Now, the powers that are set out in the US Constitution for Congress and the presidency and the federal government are actually quite limited. But because the Constitution allows them to do anything that's necessary and proper, they've massively elasticated the scope of their powers just through those three words alone. So again, when it comes to sort of trying to understand the potential capacity of a constitution, just the number of words might not be the most meaningful metric of that. But let's do a comparison of one of the world's longest and one of the world's shortest constitutions. So the longest in the world by some distance is the Indian Constitution. Ratified in 1950, these days it has nearly 150,000 words, 395 articles, 8 schedules. So it's an enormous document, and it's being added to quite regularly. So it changes a lot. The US Constitution, on the other hand, is a stripling at only 4,543 words. Slightly longer, 7,762 words if you include the 27 amendments to the US Constitution. So, but that's nothing. I mean, that's very, very short. The terms and conditions that you will have had to click on to use your phone would have been way longer than that, way longer. And we're talking about the founding legal document that governs 350 million human beings across a continental-sized landmass. It's astonishing. The efficiency of language that's been achieved through the US Constitution is miraculous. But as I was suggesting earlier, be careful that this is the textual length. How long is the text? Basically, just shy of 5,000 words. But the subtext will be much bigger than that. In other words, the words that are extruded from the text, like necessary and proper, subtextually means all sorts of other things. And also, of course, it connects to context. So you've got text, subtext, context, and then you've even got intertextuality, which is how one text deals with another text. So be slightly careful. It could be tempting to say, well, the Indian Constitution is massive and the US Constitution is tiny. But of course, the US Constitution is a tip of a legal iceberg, which is much, much larger. Anyway, length is an interesting thing to consider. If you're trying to engineer democracy, do you want it to be a complicated engineering puzzle? The general consensus is that brevity is better. That if you have a very long, cumbersome constitution, a bit like having a mechanism with lots of parts, it's more likely that bits of it will fail. And so it's better to keep the mechanism as simple as possible, because then it'll be more accessible in the sense that more people will understand it, and it'll be easier to manage, easier to work with. Anyway, the next question is, should constitutions be easily amendable? Is it a good thing if you can change the constitution? So once you've come up with this engineering design, do you want to make sure that it's sort of frozen in carbonite and you can never do anything with it? Or do you want it to be capable of change such that future generations, or even only a couple of years down the line, you can tinker around with the mechanism? I suppose this again comes back to the concept of control. How controlling do you think it's important to be where one generation is able to control a future generation? A famous or perhaps infamous example of past long dead generations controlling the contemporary world are the US founding fathers. So the US Constitution is notoriously difficult to change. It's only been amended 27 times. The 27th Amendment took over 200 years to come to fruition. They started the process for amending what became the 27th Amendment straight after the US Constitution was ratified. And it took until the 1990s for it finally to get all the way through the process, because the process is very elaborate and cumbersome. You have to obtain 2/3 votes in both the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then you need to get 3/4 of the states through conventions. And there's various routes you can do it, but the basic point is that it's hard. And there are lots of people that can stop an amendment, including the president, who can veto it. So it's a difficult old process to get through, and that's why it rarely happens. And defenders of this say, well, that's a good thing, because the founding fathers of the American government came up with this wonderful text. We need to protect it. This is a delicate, important thing that shouldn't just be changed lightheartedly. Detractors would say, well, it kind of means you've got the dead hand of history on you to the present day. The borderline obsessive connection that some American citizens have, say, to the Second Amendment, which is the right to bear arms, doesn't reflect contemporary anything of sort of contemporary importance. It represents something that's of 18th century importance. And it really ought to be sort of jettisoned in order for America to move forward and become a more peaceful, more just society. So there are lots of debates about this. The other extreme might be the British Constitution, whereby there's even a debate as to whether Britain has a constitution, because there is no higher law document. You can't go and look up the British Constitution in a single text. Instead, it's a collection of lots of acts of Parliament. And Parliament can just pass another act to amend its entire constitution, should it wish to. There's nothing to stop it. There's no special procedure. The way that Parliament would change the constitution is the same way that it would enact any piece of legislation. You just need simple majorities in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, and you need the Queen to sign it. And that's it. So the British approach is almost too easy to amend, and therefore gets changed a lot. And the US approach is too difficult. Although actually, having said that, the British Constitution doesn't really get changed that much. It still has quite a lot of sort of fixity, but that's not to do with the process, not to do with the institutions, but more to do with British culture. Anyway, there's some interesting debates about whether or not constitution should be easy to amend. And again, the Comparative Constitutions Project has some really interesting data on how different countries compare with regard to the extent and the frequency of their amendments. And they've got literally every country, so you can go and look it up yourself. But these timelines with the vertical bars show when a constitution was amended. And so you get a sense of how frequently they change, and which constitutions tend to be more frenetically tinkered with and which tend to be more stable. And of course, the length of the bar also denotes how long the country has even had a single constitution. So newer democracies, newer recently developing countries will have much shorter bars, such as these ones here, representing parts of Africa. Okay, so it's some interesting data to check out. It's all free, it's all very easy to access, so I suggest you go do it. These are now long dead constitutions, so these are some examples of constitutions that don't even exist anymore, and how much they were amended. Anyway, so the point of this lecture was to try and talk about whether or not we think we can amend a constitution and therefore somehow engineer society, and whether you can look towards justice and work backwards to some sort of mechanism by which justice can be obtained by rules, by a constitutional framework that can promote justice. And there were various things that we discussed, such as what sort of patterns have been present in older and newer constitutions. And that got us into talking about what it even means to engineer a society or to have a choice. Because if there are patterns in the way constitutions are designed, that suggests that there's a degree of fashion, a degree of faddiness about how constitutions get put together, which might belie the notion that there is any choice at all. It may not be the case that people really rationalize and engineer societies. They kind of just take something off the peg and they follow what other countries have done. We also sort of thought about whether or not, if you've got this social mechanism, should it be very, very complicated and long and elaborate and cover all sorts of different parameters? Or should it be small and parsimonious and discrete and deal with only a few things, but deal with them very clearly and very effectively? There's a strong debate, although in the literature, at least in the academic debate, it tends to come down in favor of short is better. But you should think about that for yourself. And then finally, we thought about, well, how easy should it be to tinker with this design? Once you've engineered a society, how much should you be able to sort of fiddle about with it? And how much should future generations be able to change it? Again, there's sort of a couple of extreme examples, the US and the UK being at sort of either ends of the spectrum here. But where on the spectrum do you think you would like your constitution to sit? Do you want it to be easy to amend so that each generation can work out its own problems and deal with it themselves? Or do you want some sort of fixity, some sort of stability, some pillars in the sand so that your state is stable and can deal with short-term problems that might arise, which could otherwise sort of just wash it away? These are all very difficult questions. And like I say, they go back to the origins of civilization. There are some fascinating people that were writing and thinking way back at the very earliest dawnings of civilization about how to achieve this, how to achieve justice, how to achieve peace by engineering societies. And there are some really interesting examples of individuals that went into territories that didn't have laws to try and build and engineer a society from scratch. People like Solon, who went off to Syracuse in Sicily and southern Italy to try and sort of just create stability from nothing. People like Draco, who's now, his name was used to describe a draconian law because his set of rules were so severe and strict. There's Lycurgus, who again was also tasked with coming up with some sort of designs. And Plato. Plato is probably one of the most famous lawgivers that history has ever produced. And that's just the West. You know, if you want to go to the East, you can, of course, look to people like Confucius, to Buddha. You can look to Hammurabi in Mesopotamia. So, you know, there's all sorts of ways you can think about how individuals have tried to look at society as if it's some sort of potential mechanism, to use an industrial metaphor, and they've tried to fix it. And I want you to have a long think about whether or not that's even possible. And if it is possible, how you might go about doing it. And even if it isn't possible, maybe we should nonetheless try. Pretend that we're going to try and fix the injustices of society, even if it's impossible. Because sometimes just the act of pretense can make it be so. It can become what's known as a self-fulfilling prophecy. In other words, where you pretend to do something makes it come to be. Ugh, this is all getting a bit philosophical and mad. So I think I'll end it there. But do please let me know if you have any questions. Feel free to either email me at matthew.williams@jesus.ox.ac.uk, or you can ask me a question now. But otherwise, I hope that's been interesting and useful, and I'll see you in a bit, in about half an hour for a session on interviews. All right, diolch everyone.